I have to tell you out of the gate before I even teach, Paul begins this section by reminding them that he had previously instructed them on how they should live. This word is peripateo in the Greek, and it means to walk. And metaphorically, it was used in the language to describe a person's daily life. So how you walk out the Christian life is what he's referring to. And he says, I want you to do this. I want you to live a life worthy. In fact, in Ephesians 4, he uses the same term, peripateo, over and over and over. And you might recognize it when he says, live a life worthy of the calling that you've been called to. That live a life is peripateo. He says, live a life of love, peripateo. In Ephesians 5:8, live as children of light, peripateo. And then in Ephesians 5, he says, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil, peripateo. And so we have this privilege that Paul is calling this church to, Thessalonica, but of course we're also being called to the same thing, that we walk in these things that we know and that we've been taught. And he tells us why, in order to please God, as in fact you are living. Pleasing God. One of the primary goals, by the way, of the Apostle Paul, he tells us that in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And I love Paul. One of the things about Paul, among other things, is that he was an incredible disciple maker. I mean, he had a passion for helping other people walk with the Lord. And so as far along as he was, wherever Paul was, he was bringing people behind him. And he was famous for his lines. A lot of them were just unbelievable. But one of the ones that are so instrumental in my life as it relates to disciple making is follow me as I follow Christ. And so Paul was willing to say those words to the Thessalonican church, in fact, to anyone that he was around. And so Paul was living this life of pleasuring God, finding out what pleased God, and then living that way in obedience to the Word of God. And then he would call other people to do the same because it was such an abundant, fruitful experience. And it also honored God. And so we find in Ephesians chapter 5, as he's talking to the church there about living as children of light, peripateo again, he says, find out what pleases the Lord. Find out. That word find out, by the way, is an investigative term that means almost like CSI. You know, it's like you research it and you look in the background and you find out what it means and how it fits and what God's will is. And the way that we find that out, of course, as believers is that we become students of this book. And as we become students of this book, we find out what pleases God. So Paul says, all these things that we've instructed you, all these things that we've passed on to you, we want to encourage you in these things so that you can continue to please the Lord. And he goes on to say in the last part of verse 1, we urge and ask you to do this more and more.